So good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming back so quickly after the coffee break. I hope you're benefiting still massively from this regional roundtable. And I'm sure that this next session that's going to really, and mostly be focused on how climate change is already impacting our lives and our private lives, but also our business lives, our financial decisions. I trust that this discussion will also be, very useful and insightful to you. My name is Remco Fischer. I'm the climate change lead at UNEP. And today we'll have actually two climate sessions. This one now, again, mostly focused on physical climate change, adaptation, resilience building, etc. But not only, and later in the day, we'll also have a session more on the carbon side of things, the decarbonization, the mitigation side of things. We have a great panel, an expert panel for this session here. We have just to my left here, Nicola, who's the leader on resilience and development program at the Oxford Program on Systemic Resilience at University of Oxford. We have then Cinzia Losenno, who's a senior climate change specialist at the European Investment Bank at the EIB. And at the other side of the panel, Mauro, Accurso, who's a senior business development manager here in Madrid for the Iberian Peninsula. So before going into the discussion, I just wanted to give a little bit of a backdrop as to what's the situation at the moment with physical climate change out there. What are we seeing now, and where are we headed? So I'll give you a few facts and a few statistics in a few moments, but I also wanted to invite all of you for that background to just, reflect on this and think about it and close your eyes perhaps and remember, in your own lifetimes how weather patterns and weather systems and climate change systems already have changed. And remember, if you're based here in Madrid in Spain, if you go back to your childhood perhaps and you remember, how the European summers used to be in your childhood, and how the European summers have become here in the last 5 years, perhaps also that starts giving you a sense of, what we're dealing with here. And it gives you a sense as to, how things like all of these extreme weather events are becoming so much more intense, so much more frequent in a matter of just like a decade. Whether it's the heat waves that we've been experiencing across many parts of the world, especially here in Spain, whether it's the floods that we are experiencing around many parts of the world, especially here in Spain and other countries around the Mediterranean basin, contemplate that, reflect on it, how fast these changes are happening. And I think that's going to give you immediately, without looking at those global statistics, a feel as to what's the challenge here. And it might actually also, very often out there, I get very frustrated by people saying, yeah, but the weather and the climate has always changed. That's nothing new here, nothing new to see. And it's true, it's always changed, but if you look at the experiences that we're going through now, you will realize quite quickly, and perhaps you could go back to those people and say, yes, but the issue with the man-made climate change, not the natural climate change has been happening over millennia. The issue with the man-made climate change, it's happening within decades. It's happening within years. It's happening so fast, and it's happening in such a precipitated manner that it risks truly just overwhelming us. It risks overwhelming our ability to produce, our ability to invest, our ability to consume. Al Gore recently said it risks our ability to govern societies in an organized way if we don't take the required mitigation and adaptation actions now. And what those actions are and how the finance sector can play a role in accelerating those actions, of course, is what we want to discuss with the panel today. But let me also give you some killer statistics or some of the universal facts. We are, at this summer, and the experts on the panel may want to nuance this a little bit more, we are just touching 1.5 degrees of warming. This is 1.5 degrees more than where naturally we would be without industrial revolution and without emissions. And so we are entering, what, according to the IPCC and according to obviously the intergovernmental process, is rather a dangerous terrain. We're at 1.5 now. Our business as usual trajectory in terms of where current emissions and emissions trajectories will bring us is 2.7 degrees, in between 2.7 to 3 degrees, I understand. So kind of double the amount of climate change, which doesn't necessarily mean that the impacts will double. There's probably, thresholds there that need to be considered, so impacts may increase exponentially. And the latest calculation that I've seen from Swiss Re as to what is this going to mean for GDP. And we can, obviously, we need to look not only at GDP, we need to look at, the social impact, the impact on ecosystems, but just looking at GDP, the business as usual trajectory of reaching 2.7 degrees at some point this century would cost us 14% by 2050 of GDP. 14% of GDP annually that year and forever. If things get even worse because certain thresholds get crossed, such as the Amazon becomes a savanna, then we may enter into a territory of 2 to 3 degrees. And some analysis indicates that for especially in certain countries like Indonesia, that could translate into GDP losses of something like 30 to 40%, 30 to 40% by 2050. And so all of the other recessions that you've seen in the past, all of the other major economic impacts that we've seen in the past, for whatever reason they may have been, might actually dwarf in comparison to what physical climate change in a 2 to 3 degree world might put on us. Let me stop here. I think that was my little backdrop and my little kind of appeal to all of us to take these serious, both the mitigation but also the adaptation side of climate change in our organizations as seriously as possible. And let me, just to kick us off for the discussion, turn to you, Nicola, with the first question. What are the principal challenges from climate impacts to the finance sector? And how can we better make the case for private financial institutions to ensure that in all the decisions that they make, they embed climate resilience as a matter of course? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel. It's great to be here with you all today. So I'll sort of start off on the science side, but then very quickly move into the finance. So my own background is I sort of started as a scientist, actually working in the government in the UK, and now my job is around trying to help financial institutions to understand risk, how to use data across physical climate risk, but also into nature and social issues as well, because all of these things are interlinked, and also interlinked with mitigation, which I know we'll come on to. Just on your point about 1.5 degrees, so yes, so this year has been the hottest year on record. The number of times I've said that over the last 10 years, I think, is probably 8. It is undeniable, and I think what's having worked in this area for 20 years, and with Cinzia as well, we never expected 20 years ago, based on the projections, that we'd be sat here now and seeing the changes that we're seeing, both in developing countries and in high-income countries. We never expected that last year we would see the Rhine drying up and interrupting industry across Europe. We never expected that we would see wildfires at the scale that we have across Europe. Just looking at the news this morning, the Panama Canal is having to restrict transport because of drought. So these are big, financially material risks, and we are only on average at about 1.1 degrees, although this year we're at 1.5, but it varies year to year. So we haven't seen anything yet. So that's the bad news. And how does this impact on financial institutions? So I think we heard yesterday about the direct impacts. So we often think about direct impacts on real estate from extreme weather events, for example. Those we're able to capture quite well with the data that we have available, and it was great to hear services that are being provided to clients in understanding those physical risks. The risks that worry me are actually things like changes in our water supplies. We're here sat in Madrid, obviously Spain, big issues on water supplies impacting on tourism, other agriculture, big material impacts there. Also impacting on our food systems around the world. So actually, most of our food comes from 5 bread baskets, what we call bread baskets around the world. And actually the chance that each of those bread baskets will be impacted by a drought doubles every 10 years with climate change. So big potential risk to our food systems. Big potential risk to our infrastructure system. So I've already mentioned the Panama Canal. We saw, for example, hurricanes impacting on ports around the world and supply chains. We've seen, a few years ago, floods in Asia that impact on semiconductor supply chains. So these are real material risks that we're already seeing. And we're getting much better at incorporating those risks, or having the data you'd need to incorporate those risks into financial decisions. So it's both about the direct risks, but then also what we call indirect risks through supply chains, for example. So it's similar to a sort of scope 1 and 2, and I'll come on to scope 3 in a moment, which is really important as well. Coming on to so I want to talk a little bit about data, and then I'll come on to sort of how this links into adaptation planning, and also the opportunity as well for the investment community in this area. So on data, we often hear that data is a constraint in this area. And data is definitely a challenge, but it isn't a constraint. There are many initiatives out there around providing data in this area. One initiative that actually I co-chair with the UN and the insurance sector is trying to bring insurance expertise and UN data to the financial sector to make available the information we have. So we provide data fully openly available on physical climate risk and its intersection with nature as well, because that's a really important link between nature and physical risk, which I think we'll talk about more. So the data is becoming available, and then what we need now, which is sort of actually what I spend most of my time doing, is working with financial institutions on how do you actually make decisions based on this data? What's the guidance? How do you bring it into stress testing and scenario analysis? How do you understand which data to use? In terms of, we talked a little bit about this morning about ESG data. There's some great research actually from the University of Zurich, which looked at different physical climate risk data within the big data providers. So compared it, and you find very little correlation in the data that different data providers are using. So there's a lack of, there's not a problem of a lack of data at the moment, but a lack of transparency and guidance on how to use data well. And that's what we particularly focus on. So I just want to make a final point around more the opportunity from this, because we do often focus, there's a lot of risks, a lot of negatives here. But actually, big structural changes in our economies, in how we use water, where we grow food, is also a huge, we need money going into these areas. This is a big investment opportunity for investors that can get on top of this and support this change, this structural change that we need. Double materiality and sort of scope 3 is really important. So remember that the institutions that you are investing in, that the corporates you're investing in, are not just at risk, but they're also creating risk. So for example, if they are using water, a lot of water, so textiles, semiconductors, data centers, anything high-tech industry like this, are all using huge amounts of water. So they are at risk from water, but they are also creating risk to society. Mm-hmm. So there's a double materiality there, which often isn't considered. And this is why I mentioned the scope 3, which is really important. So actually engaging with corporates around the impact that they are having is also really important, and also an opportunity through providing products like sustainability-linked loans for adaptation, for example. BBVA is one of the sponsors of this event, does great work on water-linked, sustainability-linked loans. And so there's some real innovation and opportunity in this area as well. So I want to sort of stop on that opportunity point. That I see this area really growing, and particularly the linkages to nature, I think we'll really see this grow over the next couple of years. So I think there's a real opportunity for moving quickly.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Nicola. And I would just have a quick follow-up question on, I think if a financial institution is just getting going on wanting to understand this, really tectonic shift that's happening, what are the initial pieces that they need to get on top of? I guess you've mentioned data, and I guess data is probably twofold. You've got the data from the climate models that tell you how hazards are going to, and extreme weather is going to change in different parts of the world. I think that's kind of the forward-looking data, meteorological data is one piece that they would have to get on top of. There's the client data or the portfolio data that needs to be contrasted with that, for a risk analysis. And then there's a whole opportunity side. Does that cover it, or is there do you see a certain sequencing, or what recommendations would you make, for banks, financial institutions, perhaps the smaller ones who are just, about to get going on this?
Yeah, so I would say, so yes, definitely to everything that you've said. And there are, on the climate data side, you don't need to be a climate scientist yourselves. There are lots of data sources out there that you can get publicly available that do that sort of risk analysis for you. I would say the big piece, so I would focus on one, so those key high-risk sectors, anything related to agriculture and food, anything related to real estate infrastructure, anything which is water intensive, as I mentioned, semiconductors, textiles. These are the sort of big high risk sectors. I'm sure Cinzia will tell me I've forgotten some. And then the final piece which you mentioned, which is really important, is understanding what is a corporate actually doing about this. And this links into the transition plan and transition finance discussion, in that we need the equivalent of a transition plan for adaptation as well. And actually what we find is that a number of big corporates are actually already disclosing a lot of information about what they're doing on water, on sort of food systems, etc. But they often don't call it adaptation. So actually there's quite a lot of information there. So there's a real, I think, need to engage with investees to understand what are they doing to manage these risks, how are they thinking about it. What standards are they already adopting? There's actually a huge amount already in the existing standards frameworks in this area that just needs to be made more of. So I think that's a critical next step.
So a big takeaway already, and a big next step for all of us and for the industry is, as you, because we've been speaking transition plans already yesterday, it's becoming the buzzword in sustainable finance at the moment, and for good reason, because it's all about now, translating commitments into actions, into implementation. But as we do that on carbon, we shall not forget to incorporate into that also the physical side of things.
Definitely, and if I can just make a final point, which is that some of the same sectors are most important for mitigation as they are for adaptation. Energy infrastructure, agriculture, the big ones. Anything to do with forestry, obviously really big on both sides. So thinking about these things together is really important. If we don't think about them together, we put ourselves at huge risk. We have in the UK at the moment a big problem that we're investing in huge upgrades to our infrastructure for low carbon, but we're not thinking about resilience at the same time. And so it's falling over when we get a big heat wave or a flood. That's not a good investment if you're in this space. So thinking about these things together is the way to go. Yeah,
and at the same time, we don't want to be building new coal-fired power plants that are flood resistant. It's the opposite. So really, it's about integrating and about finding almost what are the solutions that are going to not kill several birds with one stone, but feed several birds with one scone. Thank you very much for that. And let me turn to you, Cinzia. I think you, obviously coming from the EIB, it's fair to say the MDBs, the DFIs, the public financial organizations, given their political mandate, have been looking at this, together with insurance companies, I would say, for obvious reasons, for longer than, more the asset managers, the banks, some asset owners. What have been your learnings? What are the learnings in this, process? There must be many. As EIB, of course, but then also acting in concert with that whole community, that you think the key learnings that you would want to convey to a private sector, commercial banking audience to take forward.
Thanks very much, Remco, and thanks, Nicola. You made my job a lot easier with all the fantastic background that you have both provided. So I am Cinzia. I work for the European Investment Bank, which is the bank of the European Union, and now also the climate bank of the European Union. EIB is a multilateral development bank, and we work very closely with our friends in all the other NDBs, so World Bank, African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, etc., to really support investments on adaptation and build resilience across the globe. We've been involved and been providing finance for adaptation for over a decade, and indeed some of our colleagues in NDBs have been working on this agenda for a lot longer than that. And the way we provide the finance to build resilience has evolved significantly over the last several years, from a very strong focus on the two key sectors, adaptation and agriculture, and financial instruments that are very simple, like direct lending, to really supporting adaptation activity across a variety of sectors, from urban development, energy, mobility, and critical infrastructure, to education, health, and innovation. And also the way we deploy finance for adaptation has changed dramatically over the last several years, from very simple direct lending to much more sophisticated ways of bundling the finance for this type of activities. The reason behind that evolution is really the ever-increasing severity of the impacts of climate change, as Remco described, and therefore the urgent need to really scale up finance to reduce the impacts of climate change across the globe. Over this long evolution in the world of adaptation finance, we certainly learned several lessons, and here you will hear some of the things that Nicola has already described. I think I'll focus on two lessons. The first one is the why, really, is the way the impacts of climate change really affect a financial institution. And there are, in our experience, at least two ways, of course. One is the financial exposure that Nicola was describing earlier. Of course, is to do with the ability of our clients to repay, to be in the conditions of repaying the debts, the loans. And if that's not possible, indeed, that affects our balance sheet. So understanding how the impacts of climate change might affect really the financial situation of our clients is extremely important. It goes beyond our project or simple transaction. It's really to do with their business, their overall business model and ability to cope with these risks. So if you don't understand how the clients get affected and their ability, therefore, to repay, you may be affected directly in your balance sheet. And the second way, which is no less important, is probably much more important, is simply to do with the fact that your clients will be impacted if your financial support is not sound, it's not structured around an assessment of future risks. And this is very difficult for a financial institution. We like to look backward at what we've done in the past and repeat our transactions, our operations, simply because that's a low-risk approach. But that's no longer possible. You really have to understand how risks may change in the future, and therefore what that means for your clients and how that may affect them directly. This is the double materiality that Nicola was talking about. So financial exposure and exposure of your clients. Once you build that understanding in your institution, in the case of NDBs, I have to say it has taken years. It's not been so obvious. And then you can devise your internal actions to better address those risks. So, for example, in the case of the EIB, but it's the case across many other NDBs, we had to really develop and establish business processes to screen our projects for physical climate risk, understand how and infrastructure investment may be affected by future risks and what that means now and the years to come in the operation of that infrastructure. You know, whether it's a water supply system, for example, you know, built near the coast. What does that mean if, you know, sea level continue to rise? What does it mean to that piece of infrastructure if storm surges increase in severity? What does it mean if saline intrusion, you know, continues to go up? How does that affect, you know, the operation of the water supply system? Is that really a material risk for that transaction? So the lessons there is really understand the physical risk in a systemic manner, the way it affects your institution, but the way it affects your clients, and therefore build the internal business processes that allow you to systematically understand the risk for every single transaction. The second lesson I would like to share is to do with, you know, is related to the issue of data and knowledge, I would say. Now, understanding how the future may change is really, it doesn't come natural to a financial institution. I mean, we're not climate experts, right? We are users of data. And in order to really manage physical climate risks in the operation of financial institutions, you need to build the institutional capital, which means the knowledge and the skills, the expertise on climate change. And of course, you know, the scale of that type of effort varies across financial institutions. You know, for small institutions would be commensurate, of course, but for large financial institutions, this requires significant effort to build the, you know, the capacity and the skills of our staff to be able to understand climate data, understand the uncertainties associated with it, being able to discuss that with our clients, make the business case for, you know, spending more on adaptation when that is necessary. It's not always the case, but in some cases it really is necessary. And that, you know, that effort does take a significant number of years to really build the scale of knowledge required. And we cannot do it by ourselves. We need to collaborate. We need to really work with institutions that have the knowledge, that understand climate data, and can make that data usable for a financial institution. So building bridges between, you know, the climate data information and climate services community and financial institution is absolutely key. And I think UNEP FI has a key role to play in really supporting particularly commercial financial institutions in you know, building these collaborations. And of course, there's another aspect to that, I would say, which is the fact that, you know, we are a public bank. We represent the member states, of course, but public finance can never be sufficient to fill the finance gap. So financial institutions have, you know, private one, commercial banks have a key role to play in this as well. And it's not just about, you know, managing your financial exposure, which is absolutely key to your own business, but it's also about really contributing to the positive agenda. And that's to do with scouting for opportunities. And the opportunities are there, even for the private sector, particularly to do with technologies and solutions that can help you know, people, communities, businesses build resilience across the globe. And I can dive into all sorts of examples there, but I'd be very happy to maybe discuss with you you know, over a coffee what those are. But just to give you a sense, we invest a lot in technology funds that, you know, develop water-saving technologies that are suitable for contexts of water scarcity and extreme droughts. We invest in technologies to do with materials that can respond better to excess of water, particularly useful in the real estate sector. We invest in satellite technologies that can help us in better understand how climate may change in the future. Just to say, there is also an opportunity for the private sector, and I do hope that that discussion can be maybe brought up a little bit more. Whilst risk is absolutely crucial and needs to be managed, there are opportunities for the private sector to support this agenda as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Cinzia. And just to kind of summarize some of the headlines that you've provided. Number one is financial institutions need to be able to understand the risks more appropriately and more conducively and effectively than in the past. And that means looking into the future, not into the past. It's the whole, this was really established with the TCFD at the time. Scenario, you need to be looking at the models, whether it's the energy and carbon models on the mitigation side of the challenge, or it's the climate and weather models on this side of the challenge. Obviously, easier said than done, because reading those models, understanding those models, and being able to connect the dots between those models in your loan book or your, whatever portfolio it may be, is tricky. So there's an element of building internal expertise, and then linking up, I guess, that internal expertise also with external expertise. So with all these community and partners and data providers and the modelers out there. On the opportunity side, something that both of you have stressed, that this is not only a risk spiel, that it's also an opportunity spiel. And I guess the opportunities, do I see it right to describe the opportunities, that there are two kinds of opportunities perhaps here. One is the opportunities of just getting your clients to be more resilient. Because when if you're a bank, when you get your clients to be more resilient, that in itself is an opportunity. It will obviously, stabilize profitability of the client, liquidity of the client over time, etc. But that often means is that you're embedding adaptation elements into a wider kind of relationship that we have with the client, because the client may have nothing to do per se with adaptation. But then you have, in addition to that, the more discrete, the more obvious kind of adaptation-only opportunities, such as I'm going to invest in water efficient or I'm going to lend to a provider of irrigation systems that are more water efficient, or I'm going to invest into companies involved in satellite data imagery or whatever it may be. Is that right? Am I getting this right in terms of the opportunities?
Absolutely. And if you allow me, maybe there is a third lesson there that we have learned the hard way, which is the need to really enhance the relationship with the client, to support the client in building their own ability to manage physical climate risk. And it's about really providing the advisory services, the technical assistance, so that the client, it being public or private sector, can really structure their own governance, identify responsibility for this agenda, devise policies that can anticipate, whether it's financial exposure or the exposure of the client, and therefore really model the business around, those managing those risks. We do have, for example, in the EIB, an advisory service called Climate Adapt, and we use it for both public and private sector institutions. So we work with a number of financial institutions, commercial ones, to really help them build the sort of business models that I described earlier, to identify risks in single transactions, but also understand, the context in which they operate, the key risks, the clients may be exposed to. So for us, it's not just about the single transaction. The transaction must be adapted. The project we're financing must be adapted, but it's also about the client and the whole world of operations that we can support and build capacity for adaptation.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Cinzia. Let me now turn perhaps to you, Mauro, Of course, I think you at South Pole, you work not only with banks and with MDBs, but actually with also the clients or the investee companies of those financial institutions, and the corporates, or at times we say the real economy, corporates, as opposed to the financial economy corporates. How are they looking, from your perspective, at climate mitigation, adaptation, and how are you helping them make sense of all of this and all of these various complexities, that we've been discussing today?
Thank you for the question and the invitation in the panel, and hi everybody. Just briefly to start, what is South Pole, because probably a lot of people don't know. We started as a developer of projects in the carbon market, but we are also expanding in the sense, and now we invest in projects on plastics, on biodiversity. We also manage different funds to invest in projects in landscape resilience. Also, we have an adaptation fund for Chanel, for example, and we have also the advisory side, no? And to start with what corporates are doing, how we see it is we have a framework of 5 simple steps. The first one is to measure, no? Everybody knows a company has a carbon footprint, and of course the main challenge is scope 3. Also measuring the impacts in water, in biodiversity, in waste, and measuring the climate risk with TCFD. And in that regard, only to mention that there's ranges to it, no? You can have a very fast and quick analysis of your climate risk, or you can really go granular and go in deep. So there's a big difference on that. No, you can just say, I did a TCFD disclosure, but it really depends what you actually did. So that's the first step, to measure. Second step is to have targets. In there, we help companies to set a science-based target, no? To not just say, we are going to reduce X amount, but to really, for that amount to be reduced, that climate target is aligned with what is needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. After that target, and to have really a reduction plan, the first step is to actually reduce it. In there, it really depends on the industry, it's very different, but they all essentially have the supply chain issue, and I will go a bit deeper on that later. The fourth step is to finance. No, once you have your target, your footprint, and you know what you want to do, you need to actually do it, and it takes money. And in that sense, of course, we focus in sustainable finance, but also internal carbon price, and how companies are trying to do insetting. And the offsetting part, now it's called beyond value chain mitigation. It's the more technical name, to kind of avoid saying it's offsetting like in a bad way, and the market is moving now away from that term in a sense. And the fourth step is to communicate and disclosure. We have been discussing in other panels the different frameworks, but it's also in the terms of, in the last step of communication, the advocacy power of companies is very strong, no? So I think that's the key thing, no? To really engage governments in a positive way for climate, in mitigation and adaptation. Companies have that responsibility, and we think that side of companies' advocacy, power is very important, to have a comprehensive climate strategy within a company. They can't shy away from that side, no? Okay, so to go a bit further on supply chain, when we did we do annually a survey to more than 1,200 leaders, sustainability leaders within companies. Some of the results on there, for example, were on the rise of green hashing that was mentioned yesterday. Also, the companies, and coming back to the finance step, is that 73% of the companies replied that they are raising their budgets to reach net zero. A very, very good news, because at the end, that's the signal that they are taking it seriously. But within that survey, something new, and that it actually surprises us, is that when we ask companies, why do you want to go to net zero? Why are you going to try to be a climate leader? Usually the first replies are more around the brand awareness, opportunities, having low carbon products and services. But now the third option that really spiked from one year to the other was supply chain resilience. So that's also tied to the the COVID crisis, supply chain crisis, and the Ukraine war. So everything came together, and it really showed in the survey. And at the end, that's good news because it means that companies are realizing this in different ways. That supply chain is a topic not only because of climate, but because it's really important. So in that sense, you will be surprised the amount of companies that we work with that they have very low awareness of their supply chain. So there's a lot to be done in that sense to really have the data and awareness of that. Then after that initial knowledge, of course, when they want to invest money, the first thing is more like an engagement plan, which is, it sounds little, but it's at the end the first step to really go talk to them, like prioritize your main providers, talk to them, train them, maybe a bit pressure them or incentivize them to take action, to even have a science-based target, or to measure their own footprint for the first time, to really big corporates pushing their suppliers towards climate action. But then after that, it's really trying to really invest in the supply chain, not only lightly, but really going deeper. In that sense, the challenge is a lot on really picking the right companies in the supply chains or markets within your supply chain that are the key ones for you based on the previous analysis of the risk and how to make your supply chain more resilient. There's this concept of insetting, which is not really well defined yet, I think. But essentially, companies want to invest in the supply chain, but at the same time, really be sure that it's going to have repercussions in their own emissions. And sometimes it's not that easy. You can say, I source some materials from this area, but you really don't know which farm, or like, it's not that easy. And also we help companies kind of determine the key ones there. As a way of investing in mitigation and adaptation, as I say, Sapol is focusing on the voluntary carbon market, but we are starting also to work a lot with Article 6 within the Paris Agreement, which I urge companies to really engage more on that. We, for example, did one of the first Paris Agreement, Article 6 Paris Agreement deals between we helped the Swiss government invest in Thailand via Article 6 in electronic buses.
Can you explain a little Article 6 for the audience who may not know?
Yeah, so Article 6 is one part of the Paris Agreement, which is aimed to finance climate action, essentially. You have 6.2 that is more bilateral, country by country, and you have 6.4 that is more what it used to be the clean development mechanism. And in a way, that 6.4 will interact with the voluntary carbon market. But yes, at the end, it's a way of financing climate action, and countries that are in the global south, for example, are putting different lists of the types of projects they can finance via Article 6. And at the end, it's a way of channeling the climate finance that we need. And to finalize, yesterday I saw a new report by Climate Group that I think has some very interesting statistics about climate finance. That it says that less in climate action in general is driving less than 5% of the capex in most organizations. And this, in my view, it was like a sample of leadership or leader companies, no? So we should assume that it's even less, no? Mm-hmm. And within that, like the ones that invest 5%, no, is the average, but that the ones that reply that they invest only 2% in climate action, they say that the challenge is more found in the internal money, no, the funding. The ones that reply more between 2% and 10% of capex in climate action, they say that it's not affordable, or if they can't find really the business case to do it. But when the companies that are above 10%, they start to reply in that the challenge is more like the policy and national targets that is not like super aligned. So that's, I just want to mention that because I thought it was a very interesting, to put it into context, really how much we are talking within companies in terms of capex for climate action, no?
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Mauro. That's fascinating. I want to use I think the last roughly 20 minutes that we have, to also give you a chance in the audience to ask questions to the panelists on these, pertinent questions that we've debated, but also perhaps just put to the three of you two questions that I think have come up in the discussion so far, but though that we haven't yet answered too much. One is around, I think, and I think they're interrelated to a certain extent, moving from my organization, so how resilient is my organization, to how resilient is the system within which my organization resides. And that system you can describe as a supply chain, or that system you can describe as basically even further kind of a jurisdiction, or a country, or something that is under government. So it's about, and so one question that comes to my mind, we talk a lot about, what is responsible political advocacy on climate change by private sector actors, like, things like, if you're committed to net zero, you should perhaps not be, advocating in your political advocacy against it. Those types of dynamics. But on the mitigation side of things, I know what the asks are. Carbon pricing, feed-in tariffs, energy efficiency standards, better NDCs. What do you think, perhaps to the two of you here as the adaptation experts, what do you think, the private sector should be asking their governments more or what should they be advocating for? What types of government action is needed here to really move the whole system forward, making it more resilient? What would be the main policy ask? There would be my number one question, and number two would be a little bit around how about, we've been speaking a lot about one side of the materiality. It's like, so how do I get on top of, like, again, my organization being resilient, my organization managing the risks that climate change is throwing at me, but how do we add on to that also the impact? I think we call it impact. You call it scope 3, I think, and we tend, and perhaps it's double materiality. What does the other materiality look like, from your perspective, when it comes to physical climate change, and how can, what can financial institutions, other private sectors private sector actors do about that? But perhaps we start with the policy element. Any thoughts from either of you? Nicola, perhaps you, and then.
Thanks. And actually, I wanted to give an example as well. And we talked about, interlinkages between mitigation, adaptation, nature. Yes. We talked about resilient systems. I want to give an example. So I had a brilliant student over the summer called Emma, who did an analysis of looking at portfolios of banks and looking where they were creating impact and where they were experiencing risk from another part of their portfolio. And what you could see actually was, for a lot of banks, they were actually impacting themselves. So you could see, this was the first time I'd seen this analysis, and I thought it was a brilliant analysis. So she looked at, for example, you're financing an activity which is leading to deforestation. For example, if you're financing meat production or something like that. But then that activity of deforestation is then creating more flood risk and leading to soil erosion, which is then impacting on your other activities that you're financing in the same area. So actually, you talked about the difference between the resilience of your organization and the resilience of society, but actually, we showed through this analysis that actually those things can be the same. If you're creating an impact which is then impacting the resilience of the system, but then that creates a risk for you. And I think this is something we need to realize, that when we're operating within one entity, actually that entity is so interconnected with everything that's happening in the system around it, both through the people that work there, the supply chains it's dependent on, the critical services, electricity, etc., that it requires. Actually, it's very difficult to separate resilience of an entity and resilience of the wider system. So I wanted to leave that with you. And then how that then comes into the adaptation asks of government, and this is a big issue. So I really liked Eric's comment earlier about, you know, the political winds of change and how we need to focus on the science and what we see. On an adaptation, you get exactly the same. And we're seeing, quite frankly, across my country, the UK, across a lot of European countries, across the world, significant inaction by governments on adaptation. So we're seeing, you know, infrastructure is not required under regulation to be resilient to future climate change in a number of sectors. We're not seeing a big push on the agricultural sector to be thinking about its resilience from government. So a lot of the regulations are not there. And without those regulations, it is more difficult to get a commercial return from investing in adaptation. So actually there's a virtuous circle, I think, that if we have the right regulations in place, the right targets from government, then it actually creates this market opportunity for banks and investors and others to come in and support these new areas. So I would definitely think there is a need, and we wrote a report on this for the UK called Mission Climate Ready, around what does the government need to do, what basic regulations need to be in place to actually allow this finance to flow. And that there's a set of those, both financial regulation, but also real sector regulation and targets that need to be put in place. So advocating around those, I think, is really important.
Super. So two more, key takeaways from the discussion so far. We had one earlier in terms of transition planning to ideally being integrated across mitigation, adaptation, potentially nature. And if we have any comments also on that integration, we can certainly make those. Number two, in your analysis, also when it comes to physical climate change, understanding not only the risks that are presented to you and not only the opportunities that are presenting to you, but also trying to understand how your actions, are creating those impacts that actually are going to backfire on you. And so, being on top again on the dual materiality of climate change being really important. And then thirdly, advocate. Go out there, through your associations, individually, go to your governments, go to your regulators and say, what are you doing about making our system resilient to 1.5 degrees, to 2 degrees, and is that enough or not? And take a more proactive stance there. But, over to you, Cinzia.
Thanks, Remco. And I just want to stress the importance of regulation in this area. It really lags behind, even in the EU context, which I found astonishing working on this agenda, having worked on adaptation for the last 20 years. And I'll give you a very practical example. We, as a bank, decided to be Paris aligned. So we are committed to ensure that all our investments are adapted to future climate, which means that whether you come as a private or a public sector promoter, particularly for infrastructure, it's a key issue for infrastructure projects, we ask you to assess risks to your infrastructure, your piece of infrastructure, and we ask you to adapt that piece of infrastructure on the basis of climate data inputs and projections of future climate. I mean, this is our standards on climate change. So it's something that we do routinely. But if you look at the EU context, this is not required by the law, right? So you have legislations, very well thought out legislations in the EU that do not take into account future climate. Building codes do not take into account future climate. So we have this very difficult conversation with our clients where we ask, to really raise the bar, go beyond, their national legislation to ensure that the infrastructure is viable now and in the next 20 years, whatever the life, economic life might be. But it's a big ask without, supporting regulation that really demands that kind of, forward-looking approach. So this is something that we still haven't quite resolved, even in the context of the European Union. And this is something that, we certainly see as a key barrier for, ensuring, a resilient economy, but also for, really propelling investments on adaptation solutions, as Nicola was saying. So regulation is a key barrier, indeed. We need to really work on this. that's really...
And to me, it's a little bit mind-boggling if you think
Absolutely,
about it.
it is.
Because I think if you think about mitigation and the politics and the kind of regulation or mitigation, you can pretty quickly see why it's so tough. And why, because there are, obviously, vested interests, and there is a controversy, et cetera, and there's disagreements as to, cost-benefit analysis and all of that. But when it's about adaptation, just acknowledging we have 1.5, we're going to probably stay at this level or increase the temperature in the next couple of decades. Everyone should agree, without any exception, that it makes absolute sense to make everything climate-proof. And still regulators...
There've been developments, right? The climate law,
Yes.
Requiring national assessments on climate vulnerability, and all sorts of other developments in the field of adaptation, whether they touch upon the public sector or the private sector with the sustainable finance taxonomy, etc. So there is progress, but this is still not quite a regulated issue, and that affects the impact you can have really on the ground. There's only so much you can push without that regulatory environment behind it.
Thank you. Or perhaps we go to Mauro and then back to Nicola, and then I think we can take probably 2 questions and then wrap up.
Yes, no, very briefly on policy, of course, carbon pricing, that is only, nowadays only 25% of the emissions are covered by some kind of very light carbon pricing.
Very light.
At the same time, going on adaptation, I used to work in my previous job, I work a bit on disaster response and in Latin America. And of course, you can say that the more you invest in mitigation, the less you will have to invest in adaptation. But at the same time, nowadays, as you say, we are already experiencing a lot of effects of climate change. And there are some basic adaptation investments like early warning systems that they are unavoidable. Like you can't just avoid those, arguing that it's better than the mitigation, no? And then just to another policy topic, and I think it was discussed yesterday also, is at the end is to lower the cost of capital and in general the cost of climate action investments in the global south is the key. We are not going to solve climate change just focusing on developing markets. If we don't foster that climate finance globally in the key markets, the efforts of mitigations are going to be not successful. And in that sense, there's many different ways. No, I mentioned Article 6, but you can argue there's also a big movement of trying to exchange debt for climate actions in developing countries. I know everybody will have different opinions on those, but that is the key for mitigation, really channeling the finance to the right places that they need it the most. No?
Thank you. I think you wanted to come in, Nicola, and let me do just a quick check, audience check. Who would like to ask a question? Just to know how much appetite we have in the room. I see 3 hands roughly, so we'll try to make that happen. But first, over to you, Nicola.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that the politics of adaptation can actually be just as hot as the politics of mitigation. So water pricing is one of the big constraints.
Right.
So it's exactly the mirror
Right.
of the energy price.
Right. Right.
So it is. There are a lot of difficult things. We have one of the big issues in the UK at the moment is raw sewage going into our rivers. That seems like an obvious thing to stop, but again, it's about price of water. How much are we willing to pay? And so I see a lot of things, positive things happening on the nature agenda though, because the 2 things are so linked, and the public really seems to get nature and get that actually, we need to protect the natural world. So I'm expecting to see some of these issues being helped around by the increasing focus on nature. So advocacy around that, I think, is really important as well.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's about, whether it's on water and energy, it's about internalizing externalities, and that, sadly comes with a cost. But yeah, let's turn to audience questions. I see a hand raised on that side. Or perhaps, Mustafa, we can start here. It's going to be a little bit more efficient with the lady just here. And if you could quickly introduce yourself and keep your question concise, please.
Sure. My name is Isabel Abelan. I'm the head of ESG financing in Banco Sabadell. I have a question about government action that you were mentioning, because now I feel slightly concerned because obviously we need a lot of work from governments to foresee what's going to happen, especially on adaptation. And now we have a huge opportunity with the Next Generation funds from the EU, so thousands and millions are flooding into the countries for those purposes. But I am afraid, how can we force governments from banks or from even companies to make that money go into the right pockets? Because if they're not able to foresee those things, or they haven't done the strategic work on what sectors they need to go, etc. How is that money going to be well spent? How can we force that money to be effective?
Thanks very much. We'll gather the questions and then we'll move to the answers before wrapping up. I saw one hand here and then one hand in the back.
Thank you. My name is Marcio Viegas. I'm the founder and managing director of Sustain. The business case for mitigation is not complicated, and we see a lot of investment coming to renewables, etc., but not that much for adaptation. How can we make adaptation more investable, bankable, especially when you tell investors that you're investing something to avoid a problem in the future? And yesterday we heard in another panel that there is value on that, but we at least in our experience, we find hard to find projects and also to convince investors that this is a good business opportunity. And then a tongue-in-cheek question to the moderator. I missed yesterday, maybe I'm wrong, numbers on emissions of UNEP 5 members. I don't know if you have that number or if you know if your members are reducing emissions or unfortunately growing. Thank you.
Thank you. And the final question in the back of the room.
Okay. Thank you. Salvador Doncel from Activus Capital Partners. I'll be concise. 1.5 degrees seems increasingly unachievable target. What's your take about this? Do you think it will be useful to change the public discourse to every fraction of degree counts, plus we need climate change adaptation investment ASAP? Or, this is a question.
Super. Thank you very much for those questions. We'll move to answers. We'll have to be concise. Who wants to take the first question around how can private finance get the EU to, in these, funding vehicles and structures be more focused on adaptation needs, data needs, etc. That was, I think, the question that the lady here was asking. Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to answer. So I've, like Cinzia, we've been working in this area for a long time. And what we saw on mitigation 20 years ago now needs to happen on adaptation. So mitigation, and this comes into the second question, there would not be a business case for mitigation had there not been 20 years of subsidies, tariffs. That's why there's a business case for mitigation now and why it's a strong investment opportunity. And that hasn't happened for adaptation. And to come to your excellent question, I strongly believe, and this is one of the reasons I work in finance rather than government now, is that the finance sector has a huge potential role to play. So one of the reasons I strongly believe that the mitigation agenda has moved because financial institutions said, look, if you want us to invest in this, this is what you need to do. These are the regulations you need to put in place. And I think that voice needs to be heard on adaptation as well. So we need your community to be saying to government, this is what you need to do. We want to invest in this, make it work. And to have, just the simple things, like there's a great example from the Netherlands, always on adaptation, there's great examples from the Netherlands, but they have a working group, a public-private working group on government, banks, investors on how do we set a roadmap for adaptation for the Netherlands? Where do we need to invest? And there's a dialogue on that, and you don't get that. We don't have that in my country. We don't get that across many countries. And that, simple things, I think the financial institutions can really push and make a big difference by really sort of pushing for those, exactly the same on mitigation to happen now on adaptation as well. And to be holding government to account, so because, there is, when they're putting in huge amounts of funding, you should be saying, why aren't you thinking about adaptation in this as well? It won't happen unless we shout about it.
Do you also want to cover the question around the 1.5 and it being impossible, and we're touching on it already this year, and what should we as a community do about that?
Well, that's a hard one, but I guess I'm probably the only one that works for an institution where I can speak frankly about it.
Go for it.
So 1.5. So yes, 1.5 looks incredibly challenging. So as you said, Remco, we're actually this year already at 1.5. It's incredibly challenging, but we have to get there, and we have to do everything we can because, as a scientist myself, above 1.5 degrees is a very, very difficult world for everyone, not just developing countries, for everyone. Big, big risk. So we have to do everything we can, but we do also, so I would definitely not say change the narrative. We need to, again, hold governments to account because they are not doing what they need to do to get to 1.5. Let's be frank about that. So we need to hold them to account. But on the adaptation side, and this is the difficulty, we need to realize that it is hard, and so we need to be preparing for more than 1.5. And so, there was always the old adage, prepare for, or aim for 2, prepare for 4. Now it should be, I think, aim for 1.5, prepare for maybe 3.
That's right.
Hope for the best, but plan for the worst, right? That's, maybe I can answer that question about
Please.
making the business case for adaptation. I think there's plenty of evidence out there, including UN reports and reports from the Global Center on Adaptation that shows for every single dollar spent on adaptation, you save $6. I mean, that's the headline. There is a real economic case, financial case, and a social case, I say, to really invest on adaptation. Invest now for then reaping the benefits later on in the future. So I really invite you to look at those type of reports that really show that case. We find that argument, I would say, almost obsolete now. There's not so much the need to make the business case when we talk to our clients, particularly in the public sector, but also in the private sector. It's more about, so what is the right response? What sort of action we need to take? How do we ensure that that piece of infrastructure really is going to withstand the future changes, and so on and so forth. So not so much the case anymore to for really making an argument to invest in adaptation. It's very much about how to do it, where to get the sources, the financial resources from, and how really have the highest impact with that finance.
Thanks, Cinzia. Mauro, final comment?
Yes, in terms of the adaptation, of the reality is that my view is that we need to use the tools we have now to invest in projects. So a lot of the carbon projects, they also have a lot of adaptation impacts. Mangroves, soil carbon, reforestation or avoidance of deforestation. So at the end, it's just a matter of when you do the project, you check, you focus on measuring carbon, but at the end you have co-benefits, and it's just the way it's communicated, the impact of the project is focused on carbon, so on mitigation, but it's really bigger than that. And even the community benefits are the key for the success. And then you measure the success in terms of carbon. So there's a lot of interlinkages on that. And of course, in urban areas, a lot more. Of course, you lower pollution, you lower emissions, and you improve the health. So there are some very direct things that it's just a way of looking at those, or how to finance projects. If talking about adaptation is better for you to finance a project, great. If talking about mitigation is better, at the end it's kind of the same project in a way. It's in some cases, On 1.5, I'll say that it's more a political issue now, in the sense that nobody wants to say that it's unreachable because it has very important implications to some nations within the COP discussions. So yeah, I think it's a topic that is better. It's more, I would say, let's focus on the short-term goals to reach net zero than the actual outcome of not reaching, like, not lowering emissions, whether it's 1.5 or 2. Let's focus on, like, where do we need to go and how much we need to lower emissions. So, like, the really short-term or mid-term goals are more important in that sense for me than to look, yes, net zero 2050, like, it's easy to talk in those terms and much more difficult to talk in 5 years terms, no?
Thank you. One sentence, and then we need to, I'd ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists, but one sentence from my side, responding to one of the questions from there. All UNEP FI members who commit to net zero for their portfolios as part of the alliances that we have have to report annually on progress. So have to annually report on how the emissions profile of their portfolio is developing and whether that is really happening in line with the science. And with that, join me again in thanking our great panelists today.